In our last video, we talked about MIDI and also about high-level representation. In this video, we're going to unpack MIDI a little bit further. If we think back to the dawn of MIDI, in the early 1980s, it's unusual in some respects in that it's one of those few times where manufacturers came together to make a lasting piece of technology. Normally when we think about technology, it's all competitive and sort of proprietary. But in this instance, a whole bunch of music manufacturers came together and made something that was really lasting.
That's right, and the MIDI Manufacturers Association still continue to look after the MIDI standard to this day. And the reason that came into existence was essentially an issue going back to the 1960s and 70s, where you had a range of different electronic musical devices that wouldn't really communicate or work well together.
By the early 1980s, this had kind of come to a head in that you had these very expensive devices and people would have large studios of equipment and no way to really tie these together. So in 1981, Dave Smith and Chet Wood from Sequential Circuits proposed a universal synthesizer interface standard to the AES, which they then developed with Iketaro Kakahashi from Roland in Japan. By 1983, the MIDI standard was published by the MMA and incorporated into the majority of electronic music devices from that point.
That's right, and one of the key things was that it was a low-cost interface, so it meant that synthesizer manufacturers could implement it without having an adverse effect on their consumers. And further than that, it was really reliable.
Yeah, it was interesting. One of the reasons that the manufacturers did agree to collaborate was because they had one condition that, incorporating MIDI into a synthesizer couldn't push the retail price up by more than $5. So it was incredibly cheap to actually implement.
That's right. What's also interesting is looking at how MIDI was conceived. MIDI was originally thought of as a hardware, language and a format. The hardware consisted of ports and plugs which connected cables together to communicate data amongst MIDI devices. It's a pretty old system. It was using a 5-pin DIN. Today you mostly see people using USB cables.
Yeah, and over this kind of connection hardware, obviously they developed a language, and that language, again, by modern standards, is somewhat archaic, but nonetheless it does exactly what MIDI needs it to do, which is basically send a set of instructions between the two devices and enable control of all elements of those different devices. So things like when to play a note, what sound that note should be, and other parameters as well.
That's right, and like any language, it was really just made up of sentences and words, and the words were called bytes, and they were communicated amongst different devices.
Yeah, and like a language, MIDI also needed some way to be stored, and so there was also a storage format developed, and you would have seen on your system files perhaps with the .mid file extension, and those files come in three different types: type 0, type 1 and type 2. And the basic difference between them, type 0 and type 1 are the most commonly used types, and type 0 stores all MIDI information just on one track, while type 1 allows for multiple instruments to be stored, so you can actually save a part for each instrument.
That's right, and originally those files were actually stored on hardware sequences, but over time computer manufacturers, software engineers saw the benefits of MIDI and would eventually use that file format to store MIDI data on a computer. Yeah,
in our next video, we're going to dig down a bit more deeply into some of the hardware of MIDI and just the way it's evolved over time, looking at both some historical and also some modern MIDI devices.